Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We got another solo album review of the newest project from Beyonce, Renaissance. Let's open this up with a question. Are you more of a fan of Beyonce's music or of her cult of personality? Now, some of you will say they're obviously one and the same, or at least that said massive, borderline messianic cult of personality is a huge part of her overall appeal, given how much of it's an integral part of her music. But I'm not sure that's entirely the case. Certainly didn't feel as true in the 2000s. Yeah, she always carried herself and delivered music as if she's the most important and powerful presence in the room, but it kind of felt like there was more competition for that throne that in the 2010s she seemed to claim and assume, and nobody really could touch her. And that's kind of fascinating that pop culture at large just seemed to accept all that. Great music and a terrific live show, that will mostly get you there, but it's worth highlighting just how shrewd and well calculated the marketing and opulence of it all is. A glamour that's enraptured so many the past decade, and yet it still feels like I'm on the outside looking in. Don't get me wrong, I know I'm not the target audience of Beyonce's music or art, but she's also the greatest argument in being able to transcend those boundaries. She proved it in 2016 with Lemonade, one of the best albums of that year. But the more I've thought about it, the more that project feels like an anomaly in her catalog. The points where there were real cracks in the armor, where the deification was demystified, and for as much as it was all still kind of calculated, it was the first time Beyonce's raw humanity really resonated for me. There were stakes, there was credible human drama, it just felt more tangibly real. In other words, it flew in the face of many of the reasons why folks revere Beyonce. And if you listen to certain diehard members of the Beehive, many of them don't cite that as one of their favorites. They'll usually go to 2013's self-titled album or 2011's 4, the only other album in her catalog I would agree is legit great. And that's the other thing, if you're not in that cult, you gotta run off the catalog, and I'm sorry, even if there's a modicum of quality, to me it's uneven. I've never liked Destiny's Child. The first two albums are mixed bags. I Am Sasha Fierce is a dud that's aged really badly. Her choice of singles has always been kinda lousy, even for the albums I like or love, and let's be brutally honest here. Everything Is Love was mid back in 2018, and it's basically a footnote in her career now, more notable for the tour around it than anything else. And that will take us to the new album, where I didn't know what to expect. I didn't believe for a second that Break My Soul would be indicative of the entire project, but given that I'm kind of middling on that song at best, I wasn't sure where anything else would really fall out. If you don't count Everything Is Love, and I wouldn't blame you, this is her first proper album in 6 years. It's tough to have any idea where the hell she might be going with it, even going off the credits. So what did she deliver with Renaissance? You know what frustrates me with all this? It's not that I think this album is bad. For what it is, you can argue it mostly succeeds. It gives the fans exactly what they want, especially those who didn't fully vibe with Lemonade and were looking for something lighter or more accessible coming off the self-titled album. It's also probably not for me saying that I don't think this is her best. I've seen some discourse in the Beehive where most of them are not ranking this at the very top, although where it falls is kind of a matter of debate. No. It's the fact that as I'm working my way through this album and just feel nowhere near as impressed as a lot of critics and fans for a lot of distinctive reasons, it just leaves me with the sinking feeling that any criticisms I make will be set up to be willfully misunderstood with a lot of the same tired arguments that I've seen being used to defend Beyonce time and time again. And I don't want to have to take a defensive posture in discussing a project that if this dropped from anyone not named Beyonce, the vast majority of people would be nowhere near as kind to it. In fact, I'd actually argue this project has more parallels with, oh, I'm gonna get hate for this, Drake's Honestly Nevermind than a lot of people want to admit. Production that's trendy enough to push outside an established comfort zone, but not so much that it feels experimental or challenging or obscures the sound from where she's borrowing. Then you got content that feels kind of recycled, leans on broader cliches that aren't always a good fit in a new sound, a serious lack of more distinctive melodic hooks, and a lingering feeling that Beyonce might be the part of the album that works the least. And yes, I know, to a whole lot of people, this is all heresy. I have impugned the God Queen diva here, of which there is no comparison. So yeah, let's start there. It's been commonly observed for years that Beyonce is at her best making aspirational material, or cutting down some man who did her wrong. For her, might just be reality, but to her audience, it's a power fantasy, specifically for black women. Now obviously, I'm not in that target audience, but playing at her best, there was this organic swell, connection to her roots, that let her leverage raw, borderline volcanic firepower, first across the soul and R&B throwbacks of 4, but then with even more emotive complexity and personal stakes that came back on Lemonade. Now since she's not an aspirational figure for me, and that's obviously fine, I connected more strongly to the more grounded human moments of her catalog, where she's got the presence to command that pedestal, but she doesn't have to take it. She doesn't need it. So a pivot back towards dance music immediately felt kind of odd to me, not just because I never connected to those moments from her or with Destiny's Child, but because they're kind of at odds with her strengths and roots as well, especially as a singer. She fares better on the more intimate songs, even if I still really don't care for her breathy falsetto. But I said this when I discussed Break My Soul on Billboard Breakdown. A more imperial presence doesn't really fit well alongside the rough-edge populence bounce and house, or even on some of the disco-leaning cuts like Virgo's Groove and Cuff It, especially when she slips into braggadocious flexing material. That's always felt kinda off coming from Beyonce. For as much as her greatness is assumed to be self-assured, she shouldn't need to flex like this. And that's before she starts putting on the patois on Heated and more flamboyant ballroom vocal inflections that feel kind of like a costume coming from her. It's an expensive costume, a well-tailored one, but a costume nonetheless. Now, the argument to counter all this is that these sounds historically come from black culture. She's entitled to step into them more than the majority and then curate those sounds. And hell, embracing more swaggering Houston hip-hop can work for her personality. She's proven that before, showing off more sides of her, especially her more sexually provocative angles in the past decade. And yeah, you know what? That's true. But there are some artists who slip into that dance world more fluidly than Beyonce. I mean, Missy Elliott and all her descendants spring to mind immediately, who they'll rather work with the grooves than try to command them. Of course, the other major problem is that the lyricism took a nosedive, especially following off of Lemonade, and when we start getting into themes, this album starts to test my patience. Now, again, the counterpoint right out of the gate, this is a dance project. Lyrics are arguably the least important thing here. Beyonce's not trying to put together something as layered or personal or vulnerable or deep as Lemonade, or even some of the more self-conscious cuts on the self-titled album. If all she drops are self-affirming punchlines and flexes, she's done her job. And while I could point out the obvious contradiction of saying lyrics don't matter, and then see them flood the IG captions and highlight for a lot of folks they very much have resonance, the problem goes deeper here. In very few moments on this project, does it sound like Beyonce is having a lot of fun? I mean, we'll get into this more later, but one of the things I loved about 4 is just how joyous it felt. And you'd think for a dance album trying to sell relief that Beyonce could sell she's enjoying the vibes. But that's not the performance she's giving. It's all running on chic cool and glamorous attitude. And a lot of the writing defaults to the stark, bold-faced platitudes that underscore it, or when it gets to the more sexually charged songs, just kind of gets a bit goofy without selling it all that well. Less like there's a joke and more that she can get away with saying anything because it's Beyonce. I think that's the only excuse as to why THIQUE happened at all, or why she calls her boobs tiggle bitties on Church Girl, or why she didn't immediately get backlash for the ableist slur in the same way Lizzo did with Girls, and she certainly had more defenders. Yes, it was eventually changed. And on a side note, given how many people worked on this project, I'm surprised this was not anticipated ahead of time, but it was hard to avoid the feeling that Beyonce can say just about anything on record and receive a pass for it, or if she has to change it, she's gonna get all the more acclaim for it. And that takes us to the activism of this album, which has received a lot of praise from certain quarters for elevating, uplifting black women, and especially the queer voices that help create these subgenres of dance music. A historical curation and amplification long overdue, making the most of the platform Beyonce has provided to them. And you know, if it was just in that context, it would be something to praise. but it's all through Beyonce's filter, her declarative voice. And if you want to give her all the praise for being the center point and pulling all these voices together, you also have to include that her framing as a flexing multimillionaire many times over, it's misguided at best and flagrant historical revisionism at worst. She's not just the carnal id pulling all these disparate eras together, and it's painfully disingenuous to imply that if you casually ignore the context you don't like. Because if you go back and watch Paris is Burning, the 1990 documentary exploring New York ballroom culture and the LGBTQ scene of that time amidst the AIDS crisis, and Beyonce's explicitly referencing that on Alien Superstar, among other songs, it's worth highlighting that the discrimination wasn't just societal, but had tangible capitalistic impacts coming through the America of Reagan and Bush Sr. The balls they were finding glamour and realness with resources that they didn't have, but they could still look the part. And on some level, that might be enough. But Beyonce's framing individualizes all of it, or at the most for her and her girls. And it's not one that seriously challenges the financial power structure upholding all of this, because that would undermine her power, and we can't have that here. It just feels a bit disingenuous that it might be escapism for one class is a casual reality for the other, and attempting to bridge the gap like this feels a bit tenuous. And I'm not going to mince words. The line that pissed me off right out of the gate was on I'm That Girl. Not about not wanting power, because that's total bullshit based on her own catalog, but knocking Basquiat's off the wall. Because it's so revealing in the exact same way it was with Jay-Z on Picasso Baby nearly a decade ago. It's not about the ideas within Basquiat's work challenging systemic oppression and capitalism. It's about being so fucking rich that you can own them, and in your reckless hedonism, it's just a flex to knock them off the wall. And again, this is not new from Beyonce. This was a critique of Lemonade's activist moments as well on formation and freedom. It just feels way more obvious now because it's interwoven directly into the themes and the samples and everything else Beyonce's trying to wrap around herself. And again, it just feels off to me. It's every designer name brand getting wedged into these songs. It's referencing the Progress Pride flag on Cozy and sampling T.S. Madison, but weaving it into a flex about getting paid and being effortless on the throne. It's the label whores reference on Alien Superstar. Hell, playing the I'm Too Sexy interpolation straight when that was being a parody of the same runway material leaves the song kind of an incoherent mess for me. Probably the worst on the album. And it's the references to January 6th on Energy, where we get only double lines we cross as dollar signs, ignoring the role that monetized disinformation from billionaires pays into turning all the Karens into terrorists. Is the reference to quitting your job on Break My Soul that just had me roll my eyes. Although I did appreciate the irony of any higher thematic ambitions seeming to evaporate after that song for a series of simpler dance and sex jams. Hey, what do you know? Even if it's not Beyonce's comfort zone, and you got songs like Thick that are just completely ridiculous, and How America Has a Problem is basically a cocaine rap song about how addictive her sex is, or how you get lines like, it should cost $1 billion to look this good on Pure Honey, or how the very last lines on the album are brand name porn. I don't know, it tends to be a better project, the music's better, but that's the tension at the core. It's enjoyable when it's just these decontextualized dance jams, a pure celebration that says less but does more, but it's fragile. And when this album tries to say more, it just kind of breaks apart. In other words, it's a glamour. Now, some will argue, Mark, you're overthinking this. Most people engaging with this album do not know nor care to go this deep. It's lightweight empowerment, it's flexible release on the dance floor, and in our modern late capitalist society, isn't that enough? Revolution simply by escapism? I mean, that's certainly the point a lot of mainstream establishment critics have been trying to make, alongside assertions that Beyonce's more of a curator of sounds than an experimenter, a mosaic of ideas all stitched together, even that it's a deconstruction of what Beyonce has done before in the anonymous, sweaty blur of the dance floor. She's just like all of us. And I feel like all this is ignoring not just the text of the album, not just who Beyonce is as the central magnetic force behind this, but also that her arc or central ethos has not changed in years. It's not deconstructive. If anything, compared to the more complicated cuts on the self-titled album or Lemonade, it's more simplistic and direct. Now, that could be enough to amplify a populist streak if you just focus on the vibe, but again, this album does have lines where it's trying to say more that'll be embraced by fans directly, ignoring chunks of context to how this can feel weirdly self-serving, kind of calculated. I like that Thames and Grace Jones are on the project, but if you're going to include afrobeat as representative of important black music right now in the historical continuity she's weaving, it feels kind of odd for such a long album to then ignore the more progressive and offbeat experimentation that's been holding house and dance music together for the past decade, which comprise, funnily enough, a lot of the descendants of Missy Elliott. Again, there's just this odd exclusionary quality that creeps through the constructed arc of this album, which is what happens when you build a hierarchy and you place yourself at the very top. And that feels at odds with populist, escapist revolution on the dance floor. But then you reach a weird conundrum. If this album is calculated, there's sure as hell a lot of odd, rough edges. This is where we actually get to the production, and coming back to Beyonce having fun, it's hard to escape the feeling that with less melody, once again, Beyonce's voice often hangs as the most prominent element opposite the groove in the mix, where she often winds up commanding it rather than riding or complementing it, and where the rough edges that are supposed to imply organic release, they're kind of hollow to me. Now, this predominantly comes in the vocal mixing and the production, where the fidelity is all over the place from track to track, but this is also where we get a lot of samples and interpolations of classic house and disco, and on the one hand, it creates a pretty impressive historical tapestry. Beyonce knows her shit. On the other, I know exactly how expensive some of these recognizable samples are, especially the Donna Summer interpolation on Summer Renaissance, and no, this is not the underground. This is not Plunderphonics. You had to pay to get those cleared, and that flies in the shape of what sampling was in the 80s and 90s. This isn't even touching on the Khalees controversy, where the very most I will say is that it's very revealing of where the lines of power and solidarity really are in the music industry. But I'd argue the larger issue for me is that minus more melody outside of the vocal line, a lot of this album doesn't really stand out in the same way in terms of distinctive hooks. This is an issue I've had with Beyonce for years now, and to be fair, it's less of a factor here because the transitions are so effortless, and I remember specific samples or stylistic moods rather than the outright tune, but when the project already feels long, you'd think there'd be a little more just to stick there. But maybe Beyonce felt she didn't need to bring those in the same way given how heavily this project relies on groove. And hell, maybe that was enough, because if there was one thing that saves this album, it's the groove and the percussion. The drums just sound phenomenal across the entire album, the bass lines are impeccably balanced, and as much as this project doesn't really experiment that much in sound, it absolutely can recapture some of those old school vibes in dance music wherever it goes, like the shuffling, jingling bounce of Cozy or the retro disco bounce of Cuff It. And when this album really hits its stride on Church Girl, with the bounce soul blend flowing into the liquid bassy patter of Plastic Off the Sofa, or the sweet funk disco of VIRGO'S GROOVE, it's my favorite run on the entire album. And to Beyonce's credit, her late album run, from Blood Pop's gurgling attempt at hyperpop and All Up in Your Mind with A.G. Cook, to the seething New Jack Swing of America's Got a Problem, and the bladed vamping of Pure Honey with a killer R&B changeup, it worked better than I thought I would. Hell, as much as the lyrics annoy me on I'm That Girl, the crescendo on the back half is really impressive, as are the vocal harmonies on Heated. And hell, as much as the lyrics on Thick are absurd and the bass synth sounds like a distended fart, it might be the funniest moment on the entire album. I'll give Beyonce that. I do not hate that song. At a different time I might have, but I don't anymore. But you know, there is a certain irony to Kendrick Lamar saying on Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers that for as much as folks want him to be their savior, he absolutely is not that, and by the end of the album I believed it. And then it's followed by Beyonce saying that she never wanted this power. And by the end of this album, not only do I not believe that, she's also claiming as much power as she can get. And you know what? If the stakes stayed on the dance floor, the creation of a pure moment of escapism where all Beyonce did was curate a tapestry of black and queer music and sexuality across history, just let it all stand with vibrance and color, that might be enough. And hell, just take it on that level, this is a pretty damn good album. But it's the purposeful recontextualization and individualization of that aesthetic in the service of power that feels off to me, not aligning with the reality of the sound she extrapolated, serving Beyonce's platform, but not her artistic execution in this newfound coronation. It's no surprise that No Name called out both Kendrick and Beyonce for how performative it all feels. And while there's a part of me that can appreciate a good performance, I also can see every seam of it. And when it doesn't quite feel as fun as it should, I'm just not as mesmerized. And I'm reminded of Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer from back in 2018, a project I still feel is criminally underrated and also draws across black and queer music to weave a very expansive world, a lot of color, touching a lot of the same territory as Beyonce. But the Afrofuturism doesn't just feel more creative and personally rooted, it understands the systemic changes required to look forward, and feels utterly euphoric in chasing it. I don't know, maybe the next two segments of Beyonce's Renaissance will feel more revolutionary, a proper reformation, and I'm willing to accept we're not getting the full picture as of yet, but albums of this breadth and scope and magnitude feel like they should stand alone, and this just doesn't get as far as I wanted. On Surface Spectacle, it's good for what it is. It's gonna kick ass on the dance floor this summer. It sits around the self-titled in terms of quality for me, but I know the fans adore it. But I don't know. I wanted to like this more, so yeah, I guess it's good. But there was moments it could have been great. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Yeah, I know this review's long and kind of complicated and very political. I get that, but at the same time, when Beyonce includes those sort of political statements, I think it does a disservice not to examine them in full context, be critical, really go into depth. I would do this for any other artist in this sort of position. And if Beyonce wants to assume the throne, let's make sure that the emperor is wearing clothes. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in the scheduling process, or get albums onto my schedule, or just yell at me on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand, but options available. Outside of that, leave your comments down below. I'm happy to see them. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.